Good morning.
See each other every month.
My name's Jim Entz, and I'm professor of art here at Porterville College and the coordinator for CHAP. Just a quick note about CHAP. The Porterville College Cultural and Historical Awareness Program was organized in 2002 to enhance students' awareness of important aspects of our society to which they may have had previously little exposure or no exposure. Events such as this are offered throughout the year, free and open to the public. If you would, please silence your cell phones now, if you would. And I will give proof of attendance tickets at the door for those who want extra credit in classes after the event, so it'll be at that door. Michael Sullivan, professor of environmental and occupational health at CSUN, is a graduate of UC Davis and the University of Michigan. His expertise is in toxicology and risk analysis. Dr. Sullivan has over 20 years of full-time experience within environmental consulting firms and private industry, including the Rocketine facility in Santa Susana. Currently, he's at work on a grant from the National Library of Medicine. His research interests include environmental sampling and drinking water. Today, Dr. Sullivan will talk about the implications of the automobile on society in the early 20th century. So here he is. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. I have a question. If I speak like this, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I'm not big on microphones. So, but if it gets quiet or my voice gets tired, there's a way to turn this off, right? There we go.
Yeah. Wait until the green light goes out.
It's off. Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for being here. A hazard of being a professor at any university is the desire to speak in front of people. So this is perfect on my day off to have another group of people to talk to. I love it. So please, if you have any questions during the presentation, just raise your hand and holler and we'll dialogue. I have a couple of goals today. One is to introduce you to the cars that we drove here. Our club particularly is interested in cars 1915 or older. And that's really the very primitive years of automobiles. In fact, I'd hope to have more cars today, but we got three really nice ones. There's a 1911 Ford Model T, and I'm going to talk about Model Ts in my presentation. There's a 1914 Ford Model T, and I want you to compare those two. It's like if you went out today and bought a 4-year-old phone, which none of you would, and you try to compare it to a new phone, it would the features and the design would be different. That's the same thing that was happening at the turn of the century in automobiles. And so there's an opportunity to compare a 1911 to 1914, 3 years in the automobile world and the development that happened over those 3 years. And Dr. Baird, do some of the history students come, or were they invited?
Everyone was invited, so hopefully there's some history students
Okay.
there.
Supposedly there's some U.S. history students coming as well. So if you have questions about how that might interact with U.S. history, also ask. And I'll try and touch upon some of that. So I want to introduce you to the cars and our club. We like to find and restore and drive cars older than built before 1915. The very earliest years of automobile in the United States. So let me go through the presentation. I'm hoping that arrow makes it go forward. It does. Okay. And I'm also, just a bit more about me, I'm a professor of environmental and occupational health. I teach that at Cal State Northridge. I also have an appointment at a university in Tanzania, which is in East Africa. In fact, I'm leaving in 6 days right after this event to go to Tanzania, where I teach the same thing, environmental and occupational health. So I love teaching and educating people in things that are of interest to me. And when I'm there, people ask me what my hobby is, and I say, cars built before 1915. there's no cars even older than about 1975 in the country. So when I talk about cars 100 years old, there's not a social context within to understand that. Okay, 1901. There were cars built before 1901, but again, also disclaimer: these are my opinions, not the opinions of the college or the club or anyone else. And so people may argue, and that's okay. There were automobiles built before 1901, but I consider the 1901 Mercedes to be the first modern automobile. It had, hold on, don't jump out of your seats, it had a steering wheel. Not all cars had steering wheels before that time. Many of them had a tiller. It had fenders over the wheels. It had pneumatic or air-filled tires. The earliest cars had solid rubber tires. They were used on large carriage type of wheels. And so the engine was in front. Not all cars had the engine in front. I have a 1908 Rio where the engine is in the middle of the car. And so there were a lot of different designs that were experimented with, but I consider the 01 Mercedes to be the first example of what turned out to be the modern automobile. And if I park this next to a modern car, there would be a lot of similarities. 4 wheels, there would be brakes at the wheels, there would be pneumatic tires, radiator up front, multiple seats, steering wheel, shifter. There was a lot of things that you could compare to a modern car. So this is what I consider to be some of the earliest, the early first modern car. This car produced 35 horsepower. My Model T, the 2 Model Ts that are there are 20 horsepower. You can go out and buy a lawnmower today with more horsepower than our cars. But they were designed to meet the times. And so driving on dirt roads, not very quickly, to get from one place to another, 20 horsepower was fine. And that car was advertised to be able to go 53 miles an hour. That's fast in that car, yes?
That's really fast.
That's very fast. We drove from Bakersfield here this morning, and I don't like to drive more than about 35. That's about as fast as I'll tend to drive in the Model T. 53 is fast. The Drea brothers in Massachusetts are credited with starting the automobile industry in the United States. And one of the reasons is they built 13 examples of the same car. Up until that time, there were lots of cars built using an individual person's design, and they would build one car and either drive it or sell it, and maybe then build another car later. In 1896, the first time that multiple cars of the same design were built and sold. So that was an important change in the manufacture and selling of the automobiles in the United States. Up until that time, people built one, sold it, built one, sold it, and there were all these one-offs of automobiles. And all of a sudden, the idea is we can build more than one of the same car. That concept then changed how automobiles were built. And I'll talk a bit about, where did I put the clicker?
Oh, it's over here on that side. It's on the railing.
Oh, sorry, here it is. I'm not used to clickers.
Would you prefer a crank?
Sometimes.
Yeah, I prefer a crank.
Sometimes I don't know if you.
Right about the turn of the century, there are about 30 U.S. automobile companies building a whopping 2,500 cars that year. Not a lot of cars. This is the very beginning of this industry. Those 30 those 30 companies in 10 years grow to 500 companies building, I think, over a million, no, about 500,000 cars in about 1909. So this is a rapidly changing industry. On the lower right is that 1901 Mercedes. On the upper left is the 1896 Durea Brothers car. Look at the differences. Big wheels on the Durea Brothers, small little solid rubber tires, no steering wheel, no fenders. So that's what they were building in 1896, and that still had a lot of, it's reminiscent of the the horse-drawn carriages. It looks a lot like a carriage. In fact, early automobile manufacturers borrowed and utilized carriage technology to build the bodies for their cars. So you can see the difference between what's considered the first modern car versus in 1901 versus what was being built in 1896. But there were 13 of those cars in the upper left built. First time more than one was built and sold.
Hey, will you go back one
Sure.
and step in front of the podium?
Oh,
Thank you very much. This is for our national magazine. Thank you.
Oldsmobile, which was a car company up until a few years ago, produced a one-cylinder automobile from 1901 to 1906. It's called the Curved Dash. And you can see the curve in the front. That's why it's called the Curved Dash. Notice no steering wheel, no fenders, bicycle tires. Again, we hadn't yet kind of consolidated into what a car should look like. And that car was $650. That was a lot of money in 1904. And they produced about 5,000. Oldsmobile was a very early, successful contributor to the development of the automobile in the United States. At the same time, 1906, the Ford Motor Company was trying to get into the business. This is before the Model T. So you have a lot of companies building different cars, and eventually the Model T kind of takes over and becomes the kind of the standard of what people want to have, at least for in the affordable part of the market. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But Ford was trying to do something different. He wanted to build cars that people could afford. That's another important change in how the automobile affected our society, is because as you lower the price, more people can afford it. The more people that can afford it, it now starts making the population more mobile and be able to get around. And so this is the 06 Model N, and Ford used the alphabet, A, B, C, all the way through N to T. So you can see we're on our way to T. We don't get there for a few more years. But it's considered to be one of the first affordable cars. It was low cost, relatively easy to drive, easy to repair, strong. And let's look at some of the features. Smaller wheels, pneumatic or air-filled tires, steering wheel, fenders. You can see now how those characteristics that were from the 1901 Mercedes have really been adopted as the standard for automobile manufacturing. Ford's strategy of producing an inexpensive car, and remember there's two of them out on the quad, drives them to become one of the fastest growing and largest automobile companies in America. And in late 1908, they introduced the Model T. They built a new factory in 1910. In 1913, the U.S. is now producing 80% of the cars worldwide, and of that, Ford is producing 30%. They were a huge manufacturer. Something else happened in 1913 that also changed the way we did manufacturing in the United States. Up until 1913, the way a car was built in all the manufacturers was to get a room, put a bunch of parts in that room, and mechanics would go and assemble the car. They would assemble an entire car, and then that car would go out and be sold. In 1913, Ford said, we can do this cheaper and faster. Again, trying to drive down the price of the car so more and more people could afford to be on automobile wheels. And so they introduced, he didn't invent the assembly line. It's another senior moment. I'm going to forget half of this before it's over. He didn't invent the assembly line, but he adapted it to the automobile industry. And so now you have, you start with a chassis, a frame, and people are bolting things on this car as it moves through the factory, and then whoosh, that car goes out. Part of my training is in occupational health, and so I'm a certified industrial hygienist, and in both my research and professional work, I get involved in worker safety. The assembly line changed the way workers work. Instead of having a dozen workers working and assembling a car and doing all the different tasks, in 1913, I'm a worker and I put a bolt on. And the next car comes and I put a bolt on. And the next car comes and I put a bolt on. I don't have to be trained as a mechanic. All I need to do is know how to put a bolt on, or push a wheel on, or attach something. It changes the requirements for workers, and it changes the way they work. We're now starting for the first time to understand concepts like repetitive motion injuries, which is something as an industrial hygienist I have to work with. If someone spends all day tightening a bolt on a car as that car moves past, and that's all they do, pick up a bolt, tighten it, we're not designed to do repetitive motion over and over again. So the introduction of the assembly line, while decreasing price, increasing output, also changes the function of a worker in the factory. It's a big difference between somebody who's a qualified expert who can assemble and build an automobile from pieces versus a person that can tighten a bolt. It's an important change in how workers experience in factories in the United States. Here's a 1909 Ford. If you go out and look at the 1911 that's out there, it's actually very similar. But notice some of the characteristics. Fenders over the wheels, small wheels, pneumatic tires, steering wheel, top, lights, engine in front. Some of the things that we saw in that Mercedes. Now, this is, Steve, I think this is kind of similar to your car. And you notice there are no front doors. We hadn't figured out front doors yet. Look at the 1914, 20 feet away. My 1914, front doors. So that was a big change between 1911 and in 3 years they were figuring out, how do we put doors on these cars, makes them safer, easier to use, things aren't falling out. So the car is rapidly developing in the years that we brought with us. What sort of impacts has the automobile had? In about 1910, there was something like 1,000 miles of paved road in the United States. And most of that paved road was within cities. So if you drove down a street in Los Angeles or New York City or Chicago, in the cities you would have some type of pavement, brick or cement or something like that. Outside the city, it's dirt. The introduction of the automobile. People are now moving further and further from the cities, and now people who don't want to live in the city live in now what's called the suburbs, which didn't exist before. You had the city and you had non-city, farmland or whatever, outside. And so now people are moving outside the city, creating developments that we now call suburbs. They don't want to live in the city. How do they get to town? They get in their Model T and they drive. So it changes the place and how people live. They're no longer only living in the city where they can get to work. And that differential between the city and the suburbs has only gotten bigger and bigger over the years. Now, I'm living in Los Angeles area. There are people that drive 2 hours to get to work. That started when the automobile was introduced, because people could live a few miles out of town and drive in. And now people drive hours to get to work. It's the same idea that the car is allowed to do that. When you have people living outside the city, what do they need to drive on? They don't want to drive on dirt, and so there's more pressure to build more roads and more bridges and more infrastructure. And who builds that? The cities do. And how do they pay for it? They increase taxes. And so the automobile has an impact on how we build infrastructure, not only within the cities, but outside the cities. And when people are driving in, they get hungry. And the concept of roadside restaurants are developed. Before that wasn't an idea. Look at all the fast food now that we have, and most of those fast food restaurants are located on highways because people are driving. And so industries have been developed to support the impact that the automobile has had on our society. Ford is credited and I don't know the year, with standardizing the income of his workers. And the idea was $5 a week, I think it was, pay. And people often credit him with standardizing and increasing, improving the livelihood of his workers. Now, Henry Ford was not a very nice man. He did not do that because he cared about his workers. He did that because at that salary, they could afford an automobile, either directly or through the idea of credit. And so people who wanted cars, either inexpensive Ford or a more expensive, on the quad we have a 1913 Buick. Compare the 14 Model T and the 13 Buick. Just look at the size difference. The Buick is about 1.5 times as large as the Model T and was probably 4 or 5 times more expensive. But if you made that salary at Ford, Ford Motor Company, putting nuts and bolts on a car going by, you could afford to buy a car. So Ford had ulterior motives. He wanted to develop a working class and then build a car cheap enough for that working class to be able to buy. And then what are they doing? They're moving outside the city where property is cheaper, homes are cheaper. They're driving into the city and roads have to be built and bridges have to be built. And then all the other infrastructure, restaurants, fueling stations, gas stations now are everywhere. All that infrastructure then follows behind the development of the automobile. I want to jump to the last one and then talk about pollution last. Yes, sir.
Just so that they get the fact right, it was the year they made your car that Henry Ford standardized it to $5 per day.
Per day. I knew it was 5. I couldn't remember if it was a day or week. So $5 a day, 1914. It was a big change in how workers were managed. And many books will credit him in a positive way for doing that. And certainly it did improve the workers' lives. But he had an ulterior motive to develop a group of people who had enough money they could afford an inexpensive automobile. Thanks for clearing that up, Steve. Loss of skilled labor. if you were one of those early people, I only have a few more minutes, I'll go faster. If you were one of those early people that would assembling cars, you were a skilled laborer. To put a bolt on a car as it went by, you don't need any skill. So now you can hire more people, but there's little motivation to become a skilled worker. And that affected the workforce in the United States. Now, I study environmental pollution, air and water and all sorts of different types of impacts from industry and chemicals on our world. The automobile certainly has had an impact. The combustion of petroleum hydrocarbons in an automobile puts out pollution. But that's only one part of it. That gasoline has to come from somewhere. On the ride up, we passed hundreds and hundreds of oil wells. All those oil wells have to be put in. That oil has to be pumped out of the ground. It has to be shipped to a refinery. It has to be turned into gasoline. And so there's all these, it's like a ripple effect of the automobile. You throw the pebble in, you look at all these ripples. Now, I really like old cars, but to be honest, we have to recognize that they have contributed to pollution in our society. And this is something we are still trying to understand and deal with. And by the way, and I'm not against electric cars, but electric cars have the same problems. You have to manufacture them. They don't come out of an egg. And so you have to manufacture, you have to mine the metals, and you have to produce. And so some of the same impacts from manufacturing cars are across all the different types of cars that are there.
Over there.
Sorry. So the Horseless Carriage Club. And first of all, any questions on what I talked about, automobile and society? I've tried to just touch upon some of the main impacts. The next time you drive out of the city because your house is outside the city, that's because of the automobile. Next time you pass a McDonald's on the freeway, that's because of the automobile. Next time you pass a gas station, that's because of the automobile. The nice paved roads, that's because of the automobile. They didn't pave them for horse-drawn carriages. They paved them for the automobile. All those changes are really tied to the automobile. The goal of the Horseless Carriage Club is to restore these automobiles, preserve their originality, and then drive them and show them to people. So Steve took, how old was that young man, Steve, that you took on that? He was what, 10?
Yeah.
He went out for a little drive around the quad. I consider myself the caretaker, not the owner of my 1914. Somebody owned it before me. Somebody else will own it in the future. That car has been passing through history since 1914. The birth date of my car was April 14th, 1914. It just celebrated its 110th birthday last month. The date is actually stamped on the car. So someone else will have it. So that car is passing through history. I get to maintain it for a short period of time. And we drive them and share them with people. If you have a few minutes, please come out, sit in the car, take a picture. We'll show you how they start. We're happy, very happy to explain more about our automobiles. We enjoy driving them and we enjoy sharing them with others. There's about 8,000 cars built before 1915 that are in our registry. There are more cars than that probably, but about 8,000 people cars have been registered with the club. That's from 1915 all the way back to 1896. We have about 4,000 club members. That means that a lot of people have more than one car. You can't get 8,000 cars with 4,000 members. We began in 1937. Again, we focus on cars 1915 or older. So if you have a 1916 automobile, we just call that a used car. 1915 and older, you're in the club. There are regional groups. You're in a local regional group here. If you have it, and I can't remember your first name.
Stan.
Stan?
Stan Kelly.
Stan.
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 Stan. Very good.
Good, okay. My hearing is not what it used to
Okay,
be.
my speaking is not what it used to be.
You can ask us about the club as well, but there's a local club. If you have interest, they do tours, they have cars. I'm going to speak for them. They would love to have you come and join them.
Absolutely.
Do you have to own a horse's carriage to be part of the horse's carriage club?
No, you can be part of the club. In fact, if somebody wants to join, I'll find somebody to pay your first year's dues. Maybe I'll do it myself. You get a nice magazine. You can learn about. In fact, we have a swap meet this weekend and activities at the Famoso drag strip down in about 30 or 40 miles south of here. And it's international. We have cars and members all over the world. But that's not important. That's our magazine. The Gazette comes out every 2 months. And it has stories about cars, about events. Steve was taking a picture so we can get a story about this event in our magazine. And we're on, like everybody else, we're on site, hcca.org. If you're interested, please go online and check us out and learn more about what we do. There are blogs, discussions, national tours, swap meets, regional groups, outreach. We try and really spread the word about what we love. Here's the pic. You can see many different cars on the tours. The lower left is my car on the side of the road, probably broken down. But you can see all the other cars on the tour, and we oftentimes will get 10, 15, 20 cars coming together and driving. That's me in my 1910 Perry, which I no longer own, up in the mountains above Bakersfield, driving through the snow. And I think that's enough. I think we'll stop there. Let's go outside. Any questions? I really appreciate your patience and letting me ramble on for a half hour. Hopefully, it tied into some of the things you're learning about history. Please come out and talk to us at our cars. We'll spend as much time as you want sharing with you and letting you touch and feel and see what those cars look like.
Thank you.